Millionaire's daughters saved by a homeless man on the streets. A mysterious ring reveals an unexpected connection between them. Digging into the past uncovers shocking secrets. A man from the streets shakes the businessman's empire and conscience. If you found this story interesting, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and let us know which city you're watching from. From the height of his office on the 40th floor, Richard Thompson gazed upon New York with the same methodical expression. He used to analyze financial spreadsheets. The city, seen through the mirrored windows of the building that housed the headquarters of Thompson Enterprises, looked like a chessboard in perpetual motion, where every piece followed precise and predictable rules. At 52, Richard had built his life the way he built his ventures, with meticulous precision, obsessive planning, and absolute control over every variable. His office reflected this mindset. Every object had its designated place, every document was perfectly organized, and every minute of his day was timed with military efficiency. "Dad?" The voice of Lauren, his eldest daughter, interrupted his contemplation. She stood at the door, elegant in her executive suit, carrying a folder with the latest financial reports. At 25, Lauren was the mirror of his own determination, a young executive who had grown up in board meetings and Excel spreadsheets. "Come in, Lauren." Richard adjusted his tie, an automatic gesture he performed whenever he needed to transition from thought to action. "The reports for the new venture?" "Yes, but..." Lauren hesitated, a rare occurrence in her normally assertive demeanor. "First, we need to talk about Helen." Richard sat down in his Italian leather chair, his brow slightly furrowed. Helen, his youngest daughter at 22, was the only element of his life that consistently defied his efforts at control and organization. What happened this time? She dropped out of her graduate program in business administration. Lauren placed the folder on the tempered glass desk. She said she wants to take a photography course. Richard took a deep breath, containing the irritation that was beginning to surface. Photography? After all the investment in her education, after all the planning for her entry into the company's board, she said she doesn't want to be part of the glass empire, as she calls it. Lauren sat down, her professional posture wavering momentarily. "Dad, maybe we should..." "No." Richard raised his hand, cutting her off. "I won't allow your sister to throw away the legacy I've built for you both. I'll have a talk with her today." The phone on his desk rang, the red light blinking indicating a call from reception. Richard answered with his usual efficiency. "Mr. Thompson," the receptionist's voice sounded agitated. "Your daughter Helen is downstairs. There's been an incident on the street." Richard's heart raced, though his face remained impassive. "What kind of incident?" "She and Miss Lauren were attacked as they arrived at the building. A man tried to steal their bags, but, well, another man intervened. A homeless man, sir. He stopped the robbery." Richard was already on his feet, adjusting his jacket. "I'm coming down." He hung up the phone and looked at Lauren, who seemed just as surprised as he was. "Why didn't you tell me about this?" "I just got here. I came in through the parking lot. I didn't know..." Lauren stood up, following her father as he headed toward the executive elevator. During the descent, Richard tried to process the information. An attack? In front of his own building? It was unacceptable. His mind was already calculating the measures to be taken: increased security, additional cameras, maybe even an escort for his daughters. The elevator reached the ground floor, and the doors opened to a scene Richard would never forget. Helen was sitting on the lobby couch, still trembling, but with a disarming smile on her face. Beside her, a man with a worn appearance, tattered clothes, and unshaven beard was speaking to her in a low voice. "Helen!" Richard crossed the lobby in long strides, closely followed by Lauren. "Dad!" Helen stood up, running to hug him, a rare gesture in recent years. "You won't believe what happened, Michael. He saved me." Richard looked at the man, who now stood up with a surprising dignity for someone in his condition. His eyes, Richard noticed, had a disturbing intensity, as if they could see through the layers of control and power he had built over the years. "Michael?" Richard extended his hand, an automatic gesture of a businessman. "I appreciate what you did for my daughters." The man shook his hand with surprising firmness. "There's no need to thank me, Mr. Thompson. Anyone would have done the same." But no one had, Richard thought. And there was something more about this. Man, something that didn't fit the expected profile of a homeless person. The way he carried himself, the vocabulary he used, the gaze that seemed to hold untold stories. "Dad," Helen interjected, "we need to help him. He has nowhere to stay, and after what he did for us." Richard looked at his youngest daughter, always impulsive, always challenging his rules. Then he glanced at Lauren, who was studying Michael with a cautious expression. Finally, he turned his attention back to the man who had saved his daughters, and for the first time in years, he made a decision without calculating all the variables. "Mr. Michael, I'd like to offer you a job and a place to stay." The words left his mouth before he could fully analyze them, and the smile that formed on Michael's face, a smile that blended gratitude and something more, something Richard couldn't quite decipher, would be the first of many signs that his meticulously controlled life was about to change drastically. Richard Thompson's decision to offer Michael a job and shelter sent immediate ripples through his carefully organized family structure. The next morning, as he had his breakfast precisely at 7:15 a.m., as he did every day, his wife Beatrice watched him with a mix of concern and curiosity. "Are you really going through with this?" Beatrice asked, absent-mindedly stirring her teacup. "Bringing a complete stranger to work here?" Richard adjusted the napkin on his lap, a gesture he always made when he needed to defend a decision. "He saved our daughters, Beatrice, and besides, something tells me there's more to him than meets the eye." "That's exactly what worries me," Beatrice replied, placing the cup on the marble table in the dining room. "How can you be sure of who he really is?" Before Richard could respond, Helen walked into the dining room, her hair still messy from sleep, wearing an old t-shirt and sweatpants, a sight that always made Richard cringe internally. "Good morning," she chirped, unusual for someone who typically wasn't a morning person. "Has Michael arrived yet?" "Not yet," Richard replied, checking his watch. "I asked him to report at 8 a.m. to start training in the maintenance department." Helen sat at the table pouring herself some coffee. "Maintenance, Dad? You can't be serious. Did you see how he defended us yesterday?" "The intelligence with which he speaks. There's something different about him." "Helen," Beatrice interjected, "don't start with your theories. Your father is already being more than generous by offering him a job and a place in the employee housing." The sound of heels on the marble floor announced Lauren's arrival, impeccable in her executive suit. "I was listening to the conversation," she said, picking an apple from the fruit bowl, "and I agree with Mom. We need to be cautious." Helen rolled her eyes. "Of course you would agree, Lauren. Always so prudent, so controlled, just like Dad." "And what's wrong with that?" Lauren defended herself, her voice taking on a sharp tone. "That prudence built everything we have." Richard watched the interaction between his daughters with growing interest. It was rare to see them arguing so openly, especially about a matter that didn't directly involve the family business. Richard's phone vibrated, a message from reception informing him that Michael had arrived 15 minutes early. Punctuality, Richard noted, was a quality he appreciated. "I'll go greet him," he announced, rising from the table. "Helen, you have class today." "Lauren, don't be late for the meeting with the investors." In the building's lobby, Richard found Michael dressed in simple but clean clothes, likely provided by the housing where he had spent the night. There was something about his posture that continued to intrigue Richard, a mix of humility and dignity that seemed out of place. "Good morning, Mr. Thompson." Michael greeted him with a serene smile. "I thank you again for the opportunity. Mr. Jorge, our maintenance manager, will show you your duties," Richard explained, leading him to the service elevator. "But first, I'd like to establish some ground rules." Michael nodded, his eyes attentive. "Naturally. First, maintain an appropriate distance from my family. What happened yesterday was an exception, but I don't want any confusion of roles. Second, any problem, no matter how small, must be reported immediately to your supervisor. And third," Richard hesitated, something rare in his usual demeanor. "Third, if you need anything, you can come to me directly." The last rule even surprised Richard. It wasn't his habit to offer direct access to employees at the operational level, but something about that man compelled him to make exceptions. "I understand perfectly," Michael replied, and for a moment Richard thought he saw a glimmer of amusement in his eyes. "Although I believe some rules are meant to be reinterpreted." Before Richard could question the meaning of that cryptic comment, the elevator doors opened, and Jorge appeared, ready to begin the training. Richard watched as the two walked away, an uneasy feeling growing in his chest. Back in his office, Richard tried to focus on the reports he needed to review, but his mind kept returning to Michael. There was something familiar about him, something he couldn't quite place. He opened his notebook and began typing Michael's name into the search system, but stopped. What last name would he use? He realized that amid all the chaos of the previous day, he hadn't even asked for the man's full name. A soft knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. It was Lauren, carrying a folder with the documents for the investor meeting. "Dad," she said hesitantly, "before the meeting I need to show you something. I found this in the company's quarterly report." She opened the folder and pointed to a graph. "There's an inconsistency in the numbers that could cause us serious problems in the future." Richard examined the documents, his brow furrowing in concern. Lauren was right. There was an error that, if not corrected, could result in significant losses. "How did we miss this before?" he murmured, more to himself than to Lauren. "I don't know," she replied, "but maybe we should postpone the meeting until—" The sound of raised voices in the hallway interrupted the discussion. Richard stood up, annoyed by the disturbance, and opened the door only to find Michael animatedly talking to one of the company's most experienced financial analysts. "Are you sure about this?" the analyst asked, holding a paper with notes. "This would completely change our approach." "Absolutely," Michael replied calmly. "Sometimes the solution is hidden in the details everyone overlooks." Richard and Lauren exchanged surprised glances. What was a maintenance employee doing discussing financial strategies with a senior analyst? And more importantly, how did he have the knowledge to make suggestions that seemingly made sense? The feeling that there was something much bigger behind Michael's simple appearance grew even stronger in Richard's chest. Who was that man he had brought into his company after all? And why, despite all the alarms ringing in his mind, couldn't he shake the feeling that this might be the most important decision he had ever made? The meeting with the investors had ended surprisingly well. The suggestion Michael had made to the financial analyst, a complex restructuring of the company's debts, combined with a new financing model, not only resolved the inconsistency Lauren had found, but also opened up possibilities no one had considered before. Richard was in his office, gazing out at the city through the windows as he tried to organize his thoughts. Beside him, Lauren nervously flipped through the updated reports. "Dad," she began hesitantly, "how could a maintenance employee have that kind of financial knowledge?" "The strategies he suggested. Those are things only someone with years of experience in the financial market would know." Richard swiveled his chair, facing his daughter. "Exactly. And that's why we need to find out more about our mysterious savior." "I've already asked HR to do a more detailed background check," Lauren informed him, closing the folder she was holding. "But there's another thing. Helen has been spending a lot of time with him." Richard frowned. "What do you mean?" "She's been going down to the maintenance area frequently, Dad. Just today, I saw them talking in the garden during lunch. She was showing him her photographs." Before Richard could respond, Beatrice entered the office, her face showing concern. "Richard, you need to see this." She placed an old social events magazine on the desk. "I was organizing some things in the home office and found this." The magazine, dated 15 years ago, featured photos from a charity event organized by New York's high society. In one of the photos, partially faded with time, a group of businessmen smiled at the camera. And there, in the corner of the image, was a man who, despite the elegant suit and younger appearance, was unmistakably Michael. "Impossible," Lauren murmured, leaning in to examine the photo more closely. Richard picked up the magazine, his fingers unconsciously tracing the image. "Beatrice, do you remember him at this event?" "Not clearly," she replied, sitting down. "It was so long ago. But I'm sure it's him. And look at the photo caption." Richard adjusted his glasses and read softly, celebration of the New Tomorrow Institute. Among the attendees, major names in the financial market. Her eyes scanned the list of names until they stopped at one that made her heart race. Michael Allen Stone, CEO of Stone Investments. Stone Investments, Lauren repeated, surprised. The one that... Yes, Richard interrupted her, his mind working quickly. One of the largest investment firms in the country at the time. It disappeared from the market about 12 years ago after a financial scandal. At that moment, Helen burst through the office door, her eyes shining with excitement. Dad, you need to see this. Michael taught me an incredible photography technique to capture the light of the sunset reflected on the buildings and... She stopped when she noticed the tension in the room. What's wrong? Why does everyone look like that? Richard exchanged a glance with Beatrice before responding. Helen, I want you to keep your distance from Michael for now. What? Why? Helen protested, her face shifting from joy to indignation in seconds. He's been amazing. Did you know he knows everything about photography? And not just that, he understands art, music, and... Exactly, Lauren interjected. He seems to know too much about too many things for someone who supposedly lived on the streets. Helen crossed her arms, assuming a defensive stance that Richard... I knew well. Oh, of course, because people living on the streets can't be smart or cultured, right? That kind of prejudice is exactly the type of thing that... Helen, Richard interrupted her firmly. It's not about prejudice. It's about safety. There are things about him we need to clarify. What things? She challenged, stepping closer, to the desk. It was then that her eyes fell on the open magazine. What is this? Before anyone could stop her, Helen picked up the magazine and examined the photo. Her eyes widened in recognition, but instead of the surprise Richard expected to see, an enigmatic smile formed on her lips. So you finally found out, she said, her voice surprisingly calm. Richard stood up from his chair. What do you mean by finally? Did you know about this? Helen placed the magazine back on the table with deliberate care. He told me part of his story yesterday, Dad, but he asked me not to say anything yet. He said he wanted to see how long it would take for you to figure it out on your own. And you didn't think you should tell us something like that? Lauren questioned, disbelief in her voice. Why? So you could judge him and kick him out before knowing the real story, Helen retorted. Besides, if he wanted to harm us, he would have done so already. Instead, he just saved the company from a serious problem with that financial suggestion. Richard sat down again, feeling the weight of all the variables he now needed to consider. The man he had taken in out of gratitude was not just a homeless stranger. He was a former CEO, someone who had once held a position similar to his, someone who had lost everything under mysterious circumstances. Helen, he finally said, I need you to tell me everything he told you, every detail. His youngest daughter stared at him for a long moment before answering. I'm sorry, Dad, but I can't. I promised him I would keep his secrets. But I can tell you one thing. There's much more to this story than just a business downfall. And maybe, she paused significantly, maybe you're more involved in it than you think. The silence that followed her words was interrupted by the soft sound of knocks on the door. When it opened, Michael was standing in the doorway, still in his simple work clothes, but now Richard could clearly see the traits of the executive he had once been. Sorry for the interruption, Michael said with a serene smile, but I think it's time we had a talk, Mr. Thompson. Richard Thompson's office, usually a space of calculated decisions and absolute control, had turned into a field of unspoken tensions. Michael now occupied one of the chairs in front of Richard's desk, his relaxed posture contrasting with the stiffness of the others present. Ladies, Michael addressed Beatrice and her daughters with an elegance that seemed to have naturally resurfaced. Would it be possible to have a moment alone with Mr. Thompson? Helen was the first to move toward the door, casting a meaningful look at Michael before leaving. Lauren hesitated, her eyes seeking approval from her father, who nodded slightly. Beatrice was the last to leave, closing the door with a gentleness that only heightened the tension in the room. So, Richard began, adjusting his tie, Michael Allen Stone. Former CEO of Stone Investments, Michael added with a melancholic smile, but that was in another life. Why didn't you tell me from the start? Michael shifted in his chair, his eyes fixed on Richard. "Would you have believed me? Or better yet, would you have given me the same chance if you knew who I was?" Richard considered the question. "Probably not," he admitted after a moment. "Exactly. Sometimes we need to lose everything to see what truly matters." Michael pulled an old ring from his pocket, spinning it between his fingers. "Do you know what this is?" Richard examined the object carefully. It was an old-fashioned ring with a family crest engraved on it. "This ring," Michael continued, "belonged to my grandfather, who built stone investments from the ground up. He used to say that our true legacy wasn't in the numbers on bank accounts, but in the trust people placed in us. And yet, your company collapsed amid a financial scandal," Richard observed, keeping his tone neutral. Michael laughed, but it was a humorless laugh. "That's what the official records say, isn't it? The great stone investments destroyed by mismanagement and risky decisions. But the truth, Richard, may I call you Richard? The truth is much more complex." Richard nodded, his professional curiosity momentarily overriding his suspicions. 12 years ago," Michael began, his voice taking on a graver tone, "I discovered irregularities in some of our operations, transactions that made no sense, investments that seemed designed to fail. When I started investigating, I realized that my own partner, Charles Vidor, was behind an elaborate scheme." Richard felt a chill run down his spine. Charles Vidor was a name he knew well. He was one of the main investors at Thompson Enterprises. "Vidor was using stone investments as a front for questionable operations," Michael continued. "When I confronted him, he had already laid the groundwork. Within days, forged documents appeared, witnesses came forward with fabricated stories, and I found myself at the center of a scandal that destroyed not just the company, but my entire life. Why didn't you fight? Didn't you try to prove your innocence?" "Fight?" Miguel smiled bitterly. "Against whom? Vidor had connections everywhere that mattered. Every attempt I made to expose the truth was stifled before it even began. In the end, I realized the only way to survive was to disappear." Richard stood up, walking to the window. The mention of Charles Vidor had completely shifted his perspective on the situation. "And now, why are you telling me all this?" "Because," Miguel replied, his voice calm but firm, "Thompson Enterprises is about to close a strategic partnership deal with Vidor's Ventures, isn't it?" Richard turned sharply. "How did you—" "The financial analyst I spoke to earlier let slip a few details. And I must say, Richard, if you go through with this deal, you'll be putting your company on the same path as mine." "Are you suggesting that Vidor—" "I'm not suggesting anything," Miguel interrupted gently, "just offering a perspective based on my own experience. What you do with that information is your decision." Richard returned to his chair, his mind racing furiously. The deal with Vidor would represent the biggest growth in Thompson Enterprises' history. Everything was planned, calculated, the contracts practically ready for signing. "Why should I believe you?" Richard finally questioned. "All I have is your word against that of one of the most respected businessmen in the country." Miguel stood up, adjusting his simple clothes with the dignity of someone who once wore the most expensive suits. "You don't have to believe me. But I suggest that before you sign anything, you take a very close look at the subsidiary companies Vidor is including in the deal, especially one called New Dawn Enterprises." Richard frowned. "Why?" "Because," Miguel smiled enigmatically, "that company has an interesting history, and you might find that some of the assets it holds have a familiar origin to me." Walking to the door, Miguel stopped and turned one last time. "Ah, and Richard, your daughter Helen has an extraordinary eye for photography. It would be a shame to waste that talent by forcing her down a path that isn't hers." With those words, he left, leaving Richard alone with his thoughts and a monumental decision to make. The businessman glanced at the stack of contracts on his desk, the deal with Vidor that would transform his company into an even greater empire. After a moment of hesitation, Richard picked up his phone and dialed the number of his trusted investigator. "I need everything you can find on New Dawn Enterprises," he ordered. "And I also want a full investigation into Charles Vidor's recent business dealings, especially those closed in the last 12 years. Hanging up the phone, Richard realized that For the first time in a long while, he was no longer in complete control of the situation. And what was most surprising was that this realization, instead of terrifying him, made him feel strangely alive. 3 days after his conversation with Michael, Richard found himself in his home office, surrounded by stacks of documents. His private investigator's report had arrived that morning, and with each new page he read, his stomach sank further. New Dawn Enterprises, seemingly a shell company, had been created exactly 11 years and 8 months ago, just 4 months after the collapse of Stone Investments. The most disturbing part was the origin of its initial capital, a complex series of transfers that, when traced back, led to assets that once belonged to Michael's company. Still working? Beatrice's voice startled him. She was standing at the office door holding a cup of tea. "I needed to go through these documents carefully," Richard replied, removing his glasses and rubbing his tired eyes. "You won't believe what I've discovered." Beatrice stepped in, placing the cup on the table and sitting across from her husband. "Does it have something to do with Michael?" "It has everything to do with him." Richard picked up one of the documents. "Remember when we bought that land in Murrumbee 10 years ago? The one that became Green Valley? Our first major luxury development? Of course I remember. That's what really established Thompson Enterprises in the high-end market." "Exactly." Richard slid the document toward her. "That land originally belonged to Stone Investments. It was transferred to New Dawn in a questionable operation and then sold to us at a price well below market value." Beatrice examined the document, her expression shifting from curiosity to concern. "Are you saying that, without realizing it, we built part of our success on the ruins of Michael's company?" "Yes, exactly that." The sound of footsteps in the hallway made the two fall silent. Helen walked through the door carrying her professional camera, a gift Richard had bought in an attempt to ease the tension after their last argument. "Hi, Dad, Mom." She stopped, noticing the tension in the room. "Did something happen?" Richard and Beatrice exchanged glances. "Where are you going, sweetheart?" Beatrice asked, trying to sound casual. "Taking some photos of the city. Michael taught me a new night photography technique and..." She paused when she saw her father's expression. "What's the problem now?" "Helen," Richard began, choosing his words carefully, "you've been spending a lot of time with him." "Dad, don't start. Michael is probably the only adult in this family who actually understands me and supports my dreams. And have you ever stopped to think why he's so interested in getting close to you?" Helen laughed, a bitter sound that reminded Richard of how much his daughter had changed over the years. "Of course, because it's impossible for someone to genuinely care about me and what I want, right? There has to be some hidden motive." "That's not it, honey," Beatrice interjected. "Your father is just worried." "Worried?" Helen stepped closer. To the table, her eyes fixed on the scattered documents. "What are all these papers? You're investigating him, aren't you?" Richard didn't answer, but his silence was confirmation enough. "Unbelievable." Helen shook her head. "You can't stand not being in control of everything, can you? You have to investigate, dig around, distrust." "Helen," Richard stood up, his voice firm but controlled. "There are things you don't know, serious things involving business, money." "Ah, of course, always business, always money," she gripped, her camera tighter. "Do you know the difference between you and Michael, Dad? He asks me about my dreams, about what I see through my lens. You only ask about balance sheets and spreadsheets." Before Richard could respond, Lauren appeared at the door, her serious expression indicating she brought important news. "Dad," she said, ignoring the obvious tension in the room, "I just got a call from the office. Charles Vidor wants to move. Others closing meeting for the deal to tomorrow." Richard felt his stomach churn. "Tomorrow? Why?" "He said an important opportunity came up, and we need to speed up the process." Lauren walked into the office, placing a folder on the desk. "I brought the contracts for you to do a final review." Helen watched the scene with an ironic smile. "Amazing how business always comes first, isn't it? Well, have fun with your contracts and investigations. I'm going to do something that really matters." She left quickly, leaving a heavy silence in the office. Richard picked up the contracts. Lauren had brought his mind racing furiously. "What are you going to do, Dad?" Lauren asked, sitting where Beatrice had been moments before. Richard looked at the documents from his investigation, then at the contracts for the deal with Vidor. Somewhere between those stacks of paper was the truth, a truth that could change everything. "Call Vidor," he said finally. "Tell him I'll be at the meeting tomorrow, but I need to bring a consultant with me." "A consultant?" Lauren frowned. "Who?" Richard picked up his phone, searching for a number he had memorized in recent days. "Michael, Alan Stone." The silence that followed his statement was broken only by the distant sound of the elevator, Helen leaving for her nighttime photo shoot, unaware of the drama that would unfold the next day. The meeting room at Thompson Enterprises had never felt so suffocating. The morning sun streamed through the panoramic windows, casting reflections on the glass walls and the mahogany tabletop where several contracts awaited signatures. Richard was seated at the head of the table, Lauren to his right, while across the table Charles Vidor and his lawyers organized their own copies of the documents. The seat to Richard's left remained empty. Michael had not yet arrived. "Richard," Vidor broke the silence with his deep, controlled voice, "I see no need to wait for this consultant of yours. The terms have already been thoroughly discussed, and I have other commitments today." Richard observed the man in front of him, impeccable in his Italian suit, his graying hair perfectly trimmed, a discreet yet valuable Rolex on his wrist. Charles Vidor was the epitome of corporate success, respected in the market, feared by his competitors. It was hard to imagine that behind that facade could exist the man Michael had described. "Just a few more minutes," Richard replied, keeping his tone neutral. "I'm sure you'll find the wait interesting," as if he had rehearsed. His entrance, Michael chose that moment to appear. No longer dressed in the simple maintenance clothes, he wore a well-tailored suit, borrowed from Richard himself, that made him look once again like the executive he had once been. The effect of his entrance was immediate. Vidor, who had been rummaging through his briefcase, froze, his normally impassive face visibly paled. "Michael?" The word came out as a shocked whisper. "Hello, Charles," Michael smiled, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Long time no see." Lauren watched the scene with fascination while Vidor's lawyers exchanged confused glances. Richard remained silent, studying the reactions. "What is the meaning of this, Thompson?" Vidor regained some of his composure, his voice now laced with controlled anger. "It means," Richard replied calmly, "that before we sign anything, we'd like to discuss some details about New Dawn Enterprises." Michael sat to Richard's left, placing his own briefcase on the table. "Specifically," he added, "about how this company was formed with assets diverted from Stone Investments." One of Vidor's lawyers began to protest, but was silenced by a sharp gesture from his client. "This is ridiculous," Vidor declared, though his voice betrayed a note of concern. "Stone Investments collapsed due to mismanagement. Everyone knows that." "Is that so?" Michael opened his briefcase, pulling out some documents. "Then how do you explain these transfers? Or these emails I recently recovered?" Lauren leaned in to examine the papers Michael had spread across the table. Her face showed growing understanding. As she read, "Dad," she murmured, "this changes everything." "If these documents are authentic, they are authentic," Michael assured her. "Just like the records of the offshore accounts Charles used to divert the funds, records I kept safe all these years, waiting for the right moment." Vidor stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the marble floor. "This is a setup. You can't prove anything." "Can't we?" Richard picked up his own set of documents, the results of the investigation he had ordered. New Dawn was just the beginning, wasn't it, Charles? Then came other companies, other deals, always following the same pattern. "And now," Michael added, his voice dangerously calm, "you were about to do the same with Thompson Enterprises. Use the partnership agreement to gradually take control, transfer assets, and when you were done—" "Enough!" Vidor slammed the table hard, making the coffee cups rattle. "I won't sit here and listen to these slanders. Thompson, you've just made a grave mistake." Richard stood as well, his height commanding presence. "The only mistake would be signing that agreement, Charles. Or should I say it would be another mistake, because now I know the first was buying that land in Murrumbidgee without questioning its origin." The sound of Lauren's phone interrupted the confrontation. She looked at the screen and her eyes widened. "Dad," she said, her voice urgent. "It's Helen. She's in the lobby with journalists." Richard felt his heart race. "What do you mean?" "Apparently," Lauren continued, reading the message, "she spent the night taking photos, but not just the city. She's been investigating and photographing all of New Dawn's properties, documenting the construction irregularities, the workers' conditions." Michael couldn't help but smile in admiration. "It seems your daughter has found a way to use her passion for photography for something greater, Richard." Vidor looked from one to the other, his face alternating between anger and fear. "You planned all of this?" "Actually," Richard replied, "you're the one who planned it all, Charles. 12 years ago when you destroyed the life of an honest man. And then, when you tried to use my company to continue your schemes." He paused, glancing at Michael. "The only difference is that this time, the truth came out before it was too late." Vidor's lawyers began hurriedly gathering their papers, but Michael raised a hand. "Before you leave," he said, "I suggest you take a good look at these documents, because as of today, every penny misappropriated from Stone Investments will be tracked and recovered. Every fraudulent deal will be exposed, and this time, Charles, you don't have enough power to cover up the scandal." Richard watched as Vidor and his lawyers hurriedly left the room. Through the glass walls, he could see the unusual commotion. In the lobby, journalists gathering, cameras being set up. "Your daughter," Michael remarked, "has perfect timing and an exceptional eye for finding the truth through her lens." Richard nodded, a mix of pride and admiration swelling in his chest. Perhaps Helen was right. Maybe there was more than one way to make a difference in the business world. "What happens now?" Lauren asked, still processing everything she had witnessed. Richard looked at Michael, who was calmly organizing his documents. "Now," he replied, "I think it's time we start fixing some past mistakes. And maybe it's time I learn to see the world through other perspectives." The office of Thompson. Enterprises buzzed with a different energy that afternoon. The news about Charles Vidor and the revelations made by Helen through her photographs had dominated the business headlines, and the hum of conversations echoed through the normally quiet halls. Richard was in his office, gazing out the window as the sun began to set over New York. On his desk, the day's newspaper bore the headline, "Business Empire Under Investigation. Heiress exposes scheme through impactful photographs." "I still can't believe she pulled this off," Lauren commented, entering the room with a folder of documents. "Helen always surprises us." Richard smiled, a gesture that now felt more natural than it had a few weeks ago. "Your sister has a gift that goes far beyond photography. She sees things that we, stuck in our numbers and spreadsheets, often overlook." "Like Michael?" Lauren asked, sitting down. He also seemed to see beyond appearances. "Speaking of Michael," Richard adjusted his posture, "have you seen the latest audit reports? The assets from Stone Investments that we managed to track?" Lauren opened her folder, spreading some documents on the table. "Yes, and it's impressive. The structure Vidor set up was complex, but once we found the pattern—" "Excuse me," a voice interrupted from the door. It was Beatrice, accompanied by Helen, who was carrying her photography equipment. "I think we need to have a family conversation." Richard gestured invitingly, and the two entered. Helen looked different, more confident, more centered. Her photographs had not only exposed a corruption scheme, but had also been praised for their artistic quality and narrative strength. "Dad," Helen began, carefully placing her camera on the table, "I received an invitation to exhibit the photos in a gallery. Not just the ones that exposed Vidor's scheme, but the entire series on urban transformation and social impact that I've been developing." Richard felt a tightness in his chest, a mix of pride and regret for having taken so long to appreciate his daughter's talent. "And there's more," she continued, exchanging a knowing look with her mother. "The university wants to invite me to give some lectures on investigative photojournalism." "Helen, Lauren stood up to hug her sister. "That's incredible." "And it doesn't stop there," Beatrice added, her face lit up with a smile. "Tell them the most important part, dear." Helen took a deep breath. "I was thinking, what if we created a foundation? Something that combines art and social responsibility. We could use some of the recovered funds from Stone Investments to finance projects that document and transform realities, like we did with the Vidor case. Richard stood up from his chair, moving closer to his daughter. A foundation? Yes, Helen continued, her voice gaining enthusiasm. Michael helped me develop the project. In fact, he is late as usual, Michael completed, appearing at the door. Now dressed in a well-tailored suit, he had regained some of his former elegance, but his eyes still held that wisdom that only adversity can bring. The idea is to use photography as a tool for social transformation, Michael explained as he entered the room. Helen has a unique talent for capturing not just images, but stories that need to be told. Richard observed the man who had entered. His life as an apparent homeless person, and had ended up becoming a catalyst for profound changes, both in his business and in his family. "And where do you fit into all of this, Michael?" Lauren asked, her former distrust now replaced by genuine curiosity. "Well," he smiled, "let's just say I have some experience in rebuilding things from scratch, and maybe it's time to use that experience for something bigger than ourselves." Richard walked over to his desk, picking up a folder he had set aside earlier. "Speaking of rebuilding," he said, handing the documents to Michael, "this is something I'd like you to see." Michael opened the folder, his eyes quickly scanning the pages. His expression changed subtly as he understood what he was reading. "This is a partnership proposal," Richard finished, "not to rebuild Stone Investments, but to create something new. Something that combines financial expertise with social purpose. And Helen's Foundation would be the first project," Beatrice added, her eyes shining with approval. Helen looked from Michael to her father, her camera momentarily forgotten on the table. "Are you serious?" "I've never been more serious," Richard replied, surprising himself with the emotion in his voice. "In the past few days, I've learned that there are different ways to build a legacy, and maybe it's time for Thompson Enterprises to become something more than just numbers on a balance sheet." Michael closed the folder slowly, a smile forming on his lips. "You know, Richard, when I first walked into this building, wearing worn-out clothes and carrying years of bitterness, I never imagined we'd get here." "And where exactly is here?" Lauren asked, her voice carrying a note of genuine curiosity. "At the beginning of something new," Michael replied, looking at each person in the room. "A place where numbers and art, experience and innovation, past and future, can coexist and create something truly transformative." Richard looked at his family gathered together, Lauren with her analytical brilliance, Helen with her artistic vision, Beatrice with her quiet wisdom, and Michael, the unexpected catalyst for all this change. For the first time in a long while, he felt he was truly building something that would last beyond the glass and steel skyscrapers. The opening of Helen's photography exhibition drew a surprising crowd to the cultural space in the heart of New York. The gallery walls displayed not just the photographs that had exposed Vida's scheme, but an entire visual narrative about transformation and urban renewal. Richard walked among the guests, proudly observing their reactions to his daughter's work. Each photograph told a story, from the construction workers to the city's social contrasts, culminating in a special series about new beginnings featuring an anonymous protagonist who happened to be a certain homeless man. "It's amazing how she captures the essence of people," Michael commented, approaching with 2 glasses of champagne. He offered one to Richard as they observed a particular photograph. A man in simple clothes watching the sunset reflected in the skyscrapers. "Is that you on that first day?" Richard recognized the image. "When did she start taking photos?" "From the very beginning," Michael smiled. "Helen has a gift for seeing stories where others see only surfaces." Across the gallery, Lauren was animatedly chatting with a group of investors about the new foundation. Her administrative skills had found a new purpose in structuring projects that combined profitability and social impact. "I never imagined my eldest daughter talking about art and social purpose with such enthusiasm," Richard commented, watching Lauren gesture as she explained some complex concept. "People surprise us when we give them the chance to be more than our plans for them," Michael replied, his gaze distant for a moment. Beatrice approached the group, her natural elegance complementing the artistic setting. "Helen is looking for you. She wants to take a special photo for the series on reconciliations." Richard and Michael exchanged glances, a moment of mutual understanding passing between them. 12 years of history, of losses and gains, of fall and redemption, condensed into a moment of silent comprehension. "Before the photo," Michael said, his voice taking on a more serious tone, "there's something I need to show you." He led them to a more secluded corner of the gallery, where a series of black and white photographs was arranged in sequence. The images showed the process of demolition and reconstruction of an old building. "Do you recognize this place?" Michael asked Richard. Richard studied the images carefully until realization struck him. "It's the old headquarters of Stone Investments." "Exactly," Michael confirmed. "Helen discovered that the building has been abandoned for years, and I was thinking, what better place to start our new partnership, a symbol of renewal and transformation." Beatrice gently touched her husband's arm. "The idea is to turn it into the Foundation's headquarters. And more than that," Lauren added, joining the group, "we can create a cultural center on the ground floor, with space for exhibitions, photography workshops, a place where art and business can coexist and strengthen each other," Helen completed, approaching with her camera, "where stories of transformation can inspire other stories." Richard looked at his family gathered together, no longer divided between the executives and the artists, but united in a common purpose. Michael, who had entered their lives as an apparent intruder, had become the catalyst for a transformation that went far beyond business. "So, Dad," Helen asked, adjusting her camera, "what do you think of the idea?" Richard looked at the group around him, his expanded, transformed, renewed family. "I think it's time to create a new story," he replied, a genuine smile lighting up his face. "Great," Helen smiled, positioning her camera, "because that's exactly the story I want to capture." As Helen prepared for the photo, Richard reflected on how his life had changed in the past few weeks. His empire of glass and steel, which once seemed so solid and unshakable, had proven to be as fragile as the appearances that upheld it. But, in place of the old structures, something new and more meaningful was emerging. "Everyone ready?" Helen called, adjusting the focus. Michael stood beside Richard, no longer as an adversary or a threat, but as a partner on a journey of transformation. Lauren and Beatrice completed the group, their presence symbolizing the union between the old and the new, between tradition and change. "Now," Helen instructed, "I want everyone to look toward the future." And as the flash went off, capturing that moment for posterity, Richard realized he had finally understood the most valuable lesson Michael had brought with him. Sometimes, you have to lose everything you think is important to discover what truly matters. The photograph Helen captured that night would become the centerpiece of her exhibition, not just for its artistic composition, but for what it represented: a family redefining success, an empire being transformed into a legacy, and living proof that the greatest changes begin with a single act of courage. The old Stone Investments building was coming to life under the morning sun. Scaffolding covered its Art Deco facade, and the sound of construction echoed through the halls that had once witnessed the rise and fall of Michael's empire. On the ground floor, Helen was setting up her new photography studio, part of the cultural center that would occupy the building's lower levels. "I still can't believe we're actually doing this," she remarked as Michael helped her position some of her photographs on the freshly painted walls. "Sometimes it feels like I'll wake up and find out it was all a dream." Michael smiled, adjusting a frame that showed the building itself in its abandoned state. "You know what's most interesting? This place has never been so alive, not even in the days of Stone Investments." "How so?" "Before, it was just a symbol of corporate power," he explained, his eyes scanning the transforming space. Now it's a place of possibilities, of stories being rewritten." The sound of heels on the restored marble floor announced Lauren's arrival, carrying a stack of documents. "Helen, I need your approval for the photography workshop project for underprivileged youth," she said, her administrative efficiency now directed toward social projects. "And Michael, the lawyers have finished reviewing the Foundation's bylaws." Helen took the papers, flipping through them with genuine interest. Her relationship with her sister had transformed in recent weeks. The Differences that once separated them now seemed to complement each other. "Have you chosen a name for the foundation yet?" Michael asked, watching the sisters work together. "Actually," Lauren replied, "we wanted to discuss that with you. We were thinking of something that would honor both the past and the future." The sound of the elevator interrupted the conversation. Richard emerged, accompanied by Beatrice and a figure none of them expected to see: Amanda Vidor, Charles's daughter. A tense silence filled the room. Amanda, a young woman in her early 20s, seemed out of place and nervous. "Amanda came to see us," Richard explained, his voice gentle. "She has something important to share." The young woman stepped forward, her hands trembling slightly. "After everything came to light, after I saw Helen's photographs," she took a deep breath, "I found some documents in my father's office, things he kept all these years." Michael stepped closer, his posture showing more curiosity than resentment. "What kind of documents?" "Evidence," Amanda replied, opening her bag. "Evidence that he didn't act alone. There were other people involved, powerful people who are still out there, untouched." Lauren took the documents Amanda offered, her eyes widening as she read. "This is much bigger than we imagined." "Why are you showing this to us?" Helen asked, her camera discreetly capturing this historic moment. Amanda looked directly at Michael. "Because I'm tired of living a lie. Because in your photographs, Helen, I saw the real impact of my father's actions on people's lives. And because—" she hesitated. "Because I want to be part of the change." Beatrice stepped closer to the young woman, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "That takes a lot of courage, dear." "Amanda wants to join the foundation," Richard revealed. "She has a law degree and wants to help create a compliance and social responsibility department." Michael studied the daughter of his former adversary for a long moment. In her eyes, he saw the same glimmer of determination he saw in Helen, the desire to turn pain into purpose. "You know," he finally said, "there's a certain poetry to all of this. Years ago, actions driven by greed destroyed something important. Now actions driven by conscience are building something even greater." Helen lowered her camera, a knowing smile on her lips. "It's like that photo series I did on metamorphosis. Sometimes the most beautiful transformation comes from the most unexpected place." Lauren, always practical, was already taking notes. "We can create a specific program to identify and correct harmful corporate practices, use Amanda's experience to prevent other companies from following the same path, and document the entire process," Helen added, her professional eye assessing the visual possibilities. "Show that real change is possible?" Richard observed the scene with a mix of pride and admiration. His old dream of a corporate empire had transformed into something far more meaningful, a space where redemption and renewal walked hand in hand. "So," he addressed Amanda, "welcome to the team." The young woman smiled, unshed tears glistening in her eyes. "Thank you for giving me this chance." Michael approached one of the windows, gazing at the city that had once witnessed his downfall. "You know what's most amazing about all this?" he reflected. "How a single act of courage can trigger a chain reaction of transformation." Helen raised her camera again, capturing the light streaming through the window and illuminating the group. A father who had learned to see beyond numbers, a mother who had always known the value of compassion, two sisters who had found strength. In their differences, a man who had turned loss into wisdom, and a young woman seeking redemption for her father's mistakes. It was more than a photo. It was the portrait of a new beginning. 3 months after Amanda's arrival, the cultural center, on the ground floor of the renovated building, was buzzing with life. The space, which Helen had affectionately nicknamed Kaleidoscope, had become a meeting point for artists, entrepreneurs, and social activists. That particular afternoon, the auditorium was packed for the Foundation's first official presentation of results. Richard, seated in the front row next to Beatrice, was still amazed by the transformation he saw around him. Lauren took the stage, her traditional executive demeanor now blended with a more relaxed confidence. "Good afternoon, everyone," she began, activating the presentation on the screen. "Over the past 3 months, the New Horizons Foundation has directly impacted the lives of over 1,000 people through our programs." The images began to flash on the screen, powerful photographs captured by Helen and her students from the social photography program. Each image told a story of transformation, young people learning new skills, communities being revitalized, small entrepreneurs receiving support for their businesses. But our work goes beyond the numbers, Lauren continued, her gaze meeting. Michael's in the audience. It's about creating a new business model where financial success and social impact are not mutually exclusive. Amanda stood up to join Lauren on stage. Over the past few months, she had become a driving force in the foundation, turning her guilt into positive action. Through our social compliance program, Amanda explained, her voice steady, we've already identified and helped correct problematic practices in 12 different companies. But more importantly, we're building a network of business leaders committed to a new way of doing business. In the audience, Richard felt Beatrice's hand tighten around his. He knew what she was thinking. How a decision made in a moment of gratitude had triggered such a profound transformation in their lives. Helen appeared on stage carrying her inseparable camera. And now, she announced, I would like to present a special project we've been working on over the past few months. The screen began to display a series of portraits, faces of ordinary people, each accompanied by a story of overcoming and transformation. The last portrait made the audience hold their breath. It was Michael, photographed at two different moments, as the homeless man who had saved Richard's daughters, and as he was now, mentoring young entrepreneurs. Transformation isn't just about changing external circumstances, Helen explained, her voice filled with emotion. It's about recognizing the potential that exists in every person, in every story. Michael stood up from his seat, stepping onto the stage at Helen's invitation. When I lost everything, he began, his voice reaching every corner of the auditorium, I thought it was the end of my story, but I discovered that sometimes we need to lose everything to find something greater than ourselves. Richard watched. With pride as his family, now expanded to include Michael and Amanda, shared the stage. Each of them had found their own path of contribution. Lauren with her strategic vision, Helen with her transformative art, Amanda with her pursuit of justice, and Michael with his hard-earned wisdom. And now, Lauren announced, we have a special announcement. The New Horizons Foundation is expanding its operations. Starting next month, we will launch similar programs in 5 more cities. The audience applauded enthusiastically, but Richard barely heard it. His eyes were fixed on one of Helen's photographs projected on the screen, an image of the old Stone Investments building during its renovation. In the photo, the light of the rising sun streamed through the broken windows, creating an effect that seemed to perfectly symbolize his journey. Through the cracks, the light always finds a way. After the presentation, as guests mingled at the cocktail reception, Richard found a quiet moment with Michael on the building's terrace. You know, Michael remarked, watching the sunset over the city, when I walked in that day to save your daughters, I had no idea I was also saving myself. Richard smiled, remembering how his orderly life had been completely transformed by that seemingly random event. And I had no idea that by trying to help you, I was actually finding a new purpose for my family. From the terrace, they could see Helen's studio on the ground floor, where she was conducting a photography workshop for young people. Through the glass windows, they watched Lauren and Amanda animatedly discussing new projects, while Beatrice organized a community art exhibition. I think I finally understand, Richard reflected, what Helen always said about finding beauty in the most unexpected places. Michael nodded, a serene smile on his face. Sometimes, Richard, the greatest treasures are hidden in the stories we think we already know. The sun continued its descent, painting the New York sky with shades of pink and orange. It was the kind of moment Helen would have loved to photograph, a symbol that even endings can be beautiful when they carry the promise of a new beginning. The news arrived on a Thursday morning as Kaleidoscope buzzed with its usual creative energy. A group of international investors, impressed by the success of the New Horizons Foundation, had proposed an even greater expansion of the project, with the possibility of taking the model to other countries in Latin America. Richard was in a meeting with Michael and Lauren when Amanda burst into the room, her usually composed face showing concern. "You need to see this," she said, placing her tablet on the table. On the screen, an investigative report questioned the legitimacy of Thompson Enterprises' transformation. "From empire to philanthropy, social marketing or real change?" Lauren read aloud, her brow furrowed in concern. "Who published this?" "Joseph Martin," Amanda replied, sitting down. "My father's former partner." Michael leaned forward, his expression serious. "Martin was always Vida's right-hand man. If he's speaking out now—" "There's more," Amanda continued, scrolling to show more content. "He's questioning the origin of the funds used in the foundation, suggesting that some of the recovered money might have other sources." Richard felt that familiar sensation of control slipping through his fingers. "He's trying to discredit all our work." "Dad?" Helen's voice came from the doorway. She had her camera in hand, as always, but her expression was different. "I think you all need to come downstairs." In the lobby of the Cultural Center, a small group of reporters had gathered. Microphones and cameras pointed at a middle-aged man Richard recognized immediately. Joseph Martin. "And we need to question whether this sudden transformation is just a strategy to divert attention from questionable practices," Martin was saying. "After all, how can we trust a redemption led by a man who lived as a beggar and another who built his fortune on the ruins of others?" Helen, who had positioned herself strategically, began photographing the scene, but instead of focusing on Martin, her lens captured the reactions of the people around. The young students from the photography program, the local artists, the small entrepreneurs the foundation had helped. Lauren stepped forward, ready to confront Martin, but Michael gently held her back. "Let me handle this," he said, his voice calm but firm. Michael walked up to Martin and the buzz of the crowd gradually quieted. Helen kept photographing, her lens capturing every nuance of the moment. "Joseph," Michael greeted, his voice carrying a serenity that surprised everyone. "It's been a while." Martin seemed momentarily thrown off by the calm approach. "Michael, or should I say Mr. Stone?" "Michael is fine," he smiled, looking around the lobby. "Have you had the chance to see our space, to see what we're really doing here?" "That's irrelevant," Martin tried to regain control of the situation. "The issues I raised, they are important," Michael gently interrupted him. "And they deserve answers. Why don't we talk about it? Not here, not as a spectacle for the cameras, but as two people who know well the cost of greed and the value of redemption." Amanda approached, carrying a folder. "Actually," she said, her voice steady, "I have here all the documentation regarding the origin of the Foundation's funds, including," she paused significantly, "documents that show suspicious transfers involving your own account, Mr. Martin." Martin's face paled slightly. Helen captured the exact moment his demeanor shifted, from confident accuser to cornered man. "But that's not what we want to discuss," Richard intervened, stepping closer to the group. "What we want to show is how the money that was once used to destroy is now building something new." "Come with me," Michael invited Martin. "Let me show you our classroom, where young people from underserved communities learn photography with Helen, or our co-working space where small entrepreneurs are realizing their dreams. Or better yet, let's visit the social projects that Lauren coordinates." Beatrice, who had been discreetly observing everything, approached with a group of students from the photography program. "These young people," she said, "have some stories to tell, stories of real transformation, not marketing." Martin looked around, realizing that his attempt to create a scandal had turned into something entirely different. The reporters were now pointing their cameras not at him, but at the young people who began sharing their experiences. Helen lowered her camera, a satisfied smile on her lips. She had captured the entire sequence, not just the confrontation, but the subtle transformation that had taken place right there, in front of everyone. "Sometimes," she murmured to Lauren, who stood beside her, "the best response to an accusation is not a defense, but a demonstration." Richard watched as Michael led Martin on a tour of the Cultural Center, showing each project, each initiative, each transformed life. The man who had come to destroy was, without realizing it, becoming part of the very story of transformation he had tried to discredit. "Dad," Helen called softly, "look at this." On her camera, she showed the last photo she had taken. Martin, visibly moved, talking to one of the young people from the photography program. The light streaming through the windows created an almost mystical effect, as if the moment of transformation had been captured not just by the lens, but by the very essence of the place. The sun set over New York, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink that Helen loved to photograph. On the terrace of Kaleidoscope, now transformed into a rooftop garden with a lounge area, the Thompson family gathered for an intimate celebration. It was the one-year anniversary of the morning Michael had saved Helen and Lauren, a day that had changed their lives. The table was set for a simple yet meaningful dinner. Candles flickered in glass holders, and Helen's photographs adorned the walls of the space. "I still wonder," Lauren commented, helping Beatrice with the final touches, "if you planned all of this, Michael." Michael, who was adjusting one of the photographs on the wall, turned with an enigmatic smile. "What do you mean?" "Being in the right place at the right time. Saving us. Transforming everything." "Some things can't be planned, Lauren," he replied softly. "Sometimes life puts us exactly where we need to be, even if we don't realize it at the time." Amanda arrived carrying a bottle of special wine, the same vintage her father used to serve on important occasions. "I found this in his old collection," she explained. "I thought it was fitting to share it here as a symbol of transformation." Richard observed the scene with a new kind of satisfaction, not the old feeling of control that once defined him, but a deeper contentment born from the understanding that some of the best things in life come precisely when we lose control. Helen was in a corner of the terrace, her camera capturing the moment the last ray of sunlight touched the horizon. "You know," she said, without taking her eyes off the lens, "a year ago, I was lost, trying to find my place among spreadsheets and board meetings. And now?" Beatrice asked, approaching her daughter. "Now I understand that my place has always been here, not just taking photographs, but using my art to tell stories that matter." Lauren smiled, picking up one of the photographs that decorated the space, an image from the day Joseph Martin had visited the cultural center. In the photo, he was talking to a group of young students, his face showing a mix of surprise and emotion. "He ended up becoming one of our biggest supporters," Lauren commented. "Who would have thought?" "Sometimes," Michael reflected, "people just need to see something bigger than their own fears and prejudices to change." Richard approached the railing, looking out at the city stretching below. The lights were beginning to turn on, creating a carpet of urban stars. "You know what amazes me the most? How everything connects." "How so, Dad?" Helen asked, finally, lowering her camera. "Think about it. If Michael hadn't lost everything, if I hadn't built my empire the way I did, if you hadn't resisted the path I planned for you, none of this would exist." Amanda poured the wine into crystal glasses, passing them around. "To connection," she proposed a toast. "To transformation," Lauren added. "To family," Beatrice concluded, her gaze encompassing everyone present. Not just her blood relatives, but also Michael and Amanda, who had become an inseparable part of that circle. Helen raised her glass, but first made one final adjustment to her camera, which was positioned on a tripod. "Wait," she requested, setting the timer. "I want to capture this moment." Everyone positioned themselves, not stiffly and formally like in old corporate photos, but naturally, like a true family. Michael stood beside Richard, the two men who had started as apparent opposites and were now partners in something greater than themselves. Lauren and Amanda side by side, their different perspectives now complementing each other. Beatrice at the center, the quiet heart who had always known her family, would find its true path. The flash went off, capturing not just the people but the entire meaning of that moment. The sky at the exact instant between day and night, the city glowing below, the photographs on the walls telling stories of transformation. "You know what's most amazing?" Helen asked, rejoining the group after checking the photo. "How the end of one story can be the beginning of so many others." Richard hugged his daughter, feeling an emotion he once would have considered a weakness. "And how sometimes we need to lose control to find something far more valuable." Michael raised his glass one last time, his eyes shining with a mix of gratitude and wisdom. "To life," he said simply. which always surprises us with its unexpected paths. The clinking of glasses blended with the sound of the city below as the sky completed its transition into night. On the terrace of Kaleidoscope, an expanded and transformed family celebrated not just a year of changes, but the deep understanding that sometimes the greatest gifts come disguised as challenges, and that the most beautiful stories are written not with ink but with courage, compassion, and the willingness to see beyond appearances. The auditorium at Kaleidoscope was packed for the opening of Helen's most ambitious exhibition yet, Metamorphoses, Portraits of Transformation. On the walls, a visual narrative told the story not just of her family, but of all the lives that had been touched by the New Horizons Foundation over the past 18 months. Richard was in the front row next to Beatrice, watching as Helen prepared for her opening speech. His youngest daughter had transformed into an award-winning photographer, her images now displayed in international galleries. But more than that, she had become a storyteller of transformation. "Welcome," Helen began, her voice steady and confident. "This exhibition is more than a collection of photographs. It is a testament to the power of change, the courage to start over, and the strength we find in each other." The auditorium lights dimmed and the first series of images began to project. It was the story of Michael, documented from that first day on the streets to his current role as a mentor to young entrepreneurs. "When I started this project," Helen continued, "I thought I was documenting the story of a man who had lost everything and found a new purpose. But I discovered I was capturing something much larger, the exact moment when the destinies of several lives intertwined, creating a web of transformations." Lauren, seated beside Amanda, smiled as the next series of images appeared. Photographs of the social projects they had developed together, showing revitalized communities and transformed lives. "Our foundation began with a simple premise," Helen explained as the images continued to flow. "The idea that business and social purpose are not mutually exclusive, that success can be measured not just in numbers, but in smiles, in opportunities created, in dreams fulfilled." Michael, discreetly positioned at the back of the auditorium, watched with pride. His gaze met Richard's, and a silent understanding passed between them, like two men who had started on opposite sides of a story and were now partners in something much greater. The exhibition moved to a particularly poignant series, portraits, of the students from the photography program, each accompanied by their own images and stories. Among them, the work of a young man who had documented the transformation of his own community stood out. "Art has the power to change perspectives," Helen continued, her voice filled with emotion. "When I placed a camera in the hands of these young people, I wasn't just teaching technique. I was offering a new way to see the world and their place in it." Amanda discreetly stood up and made her way to the stage. It was her turn to speak, to share how the foundation was expanding its impact through a new ethical business mentorship program. "What began as a story of personal redemption," Amanda began, joining Helen, "has turned into a movement. Today we have over 50 companies participating in our corporate transformation program, each committed to a new way of doing business." Richard felt Beatrice's hand tighten around his. His wife had always been the first to see the potential for transformation in every situation, even when he was blinded by control and ambition. The exhibition reached its final series, a collection of images capturing seemingly simple moments, a hug between a father and daughter, a conversation at sunset, a diverse group of people sharing a meal on the terrace of the Kaleidoscope. "These are my favorite images," Helen revealed, her voice softening, "because they show that true transformation happens in the small moments, in daily choices, in gestures of compassion and understanding that often go unnoticed." Michael finally approached the stage, invited by Helen. "When I lost everything," he began, his voice echoing through the auditorium, "I thought it was the end, but it was just the beginning. Sometimes we need to lose everything we thought was important to discover what truly matters." Lauren joined the group on stage, carrying a surprise, the Foundation's first official impact report, a document that combined impressive numbers with deeply moving human stories. "In 18 months," she announced, "we've directly impacted over 5,000 lives, but the numbers don't tell the whole story. Every person touched by our work becomes an agent of transformation in their own community, creating a ripple effect that can't be measured. Richard watched his family, gathered on stage, no longer divided between the executives and the dreamers, but united in a common purpose. Helen with her camera, Lauren with her transformative reports, Amanda with her pursuit of justice, Michael with his hard-earned wisdom, and Beatrice, the quiet heart, who had always believed in the possibility of change. The final image projected was a photograph of the old Stone Investments building, now completely transformed into the kaleidoscope. Sunlight streamed through its windows, creating a kaleidoscopic effect that seemed to perfectly symbolize the journey of everyone present, like fragments of light that, when they meet, create something new and unexpectedly beautiful. The morning. After the exhibition's opening, Richard arrived early at the kaleidoscope. The sun had barely risen and the building was still quiet, except for the soft sound of a camera clicking on the terrace. "Up early, Helen?" he asked, finding his daughter focused on capturing the sunrise through the skyscrapers. "The light at this hour is special, Dad," she replied, not taking her eyes off her lens. "It's like the city is being born again every day." Richard approached the railing. Looking out at the city he once saw only as a corporate chessboard, now revealed as a living, pulsating organism, full of stories waiting to be told. "Your photos yesterday," he began, searching for the right words. "They showed me something I had never noticed before." "What?" Helen lowered her camera, turning to her father. "Transformation is a continuous process. It's not something that happens once and then it's done. It's something we choose every day." The sound of the elevator announced someone else's arrival. It was Michael, carrying an old briefcase Richard had never seen before. "I thought I'd find you all here," he smiled, joining them by the windowsill. "I brought something I want to share." From the briefcase, Michael pulled out a set of old photographs, images of Stone Investments in its glory days, but also personal photos, moments captured with his own family before everything fell apart. "Why are you showing us this now?" Helen asked softly, handling the photos with reverent care. "Because yesterday, seeing your exhibition, I realized something important," Michael replied. "We can't erase the past, but we can choose how it transforms us." Lauren and Amanda arrived together, followed by Beatrice. It was as if everyone had been drawn to that moment, to that place where everything had begun to change. "We have news," Lauren announced, barely containing her excitement. "The business mentorship program is being requested by companies from other countries. They want to implement our corporate transformation model." "And that's not all," Amanda added. "I got a call from my father this morning." Everyone turned to her, surprised. Charles Vidor had kept his distance since his scheme was exposed. "He wants to meet with me," Amanda continued, her voice trembling slightly. "He said he saw the photos from the exhibition online, that he wants to understand, wants to try." "Start over," Michael suggested gently. Amanda nodded, unshed tears glistening in her eyes. Helen raised her camera again, but this time not to photograph the sunrise. Her focus was on the group gathered there, her extended family, each face telling a unique story of transformation. "You know what's most amazing?" she reflected, lowering the camera. "How each person here represents a different form of change. Dad, you learned to let go of control. Lauren discovered that numbers can tell human stories. Amanda turned guilt into purpose. Michael taught us that sometimes we need to lose everything to find something greater," Richard added, placing a hand on his friend's shoulder. Beatrice, who had been silently observing until then, stepped closer to the group. "And you, Helen, taught us to see beauty where we once only saw problems." The sun had fully risen, and the kaleidoscope was coming to life. The first students of the photography program arrived, their lively voices echoing through the lobby. Downstairs, the social entrepreneurs prepared for another day of meaningful work. "I think we need a photo," Helen decided, setting the timer on her camera to mark this moment. They positioned themselves naturally, no longer divided by titles or roles, but united by something much deeper. The morning light streamed through the terrace windows, creating a prismatic effect that seemed to envelop the group in a luminous embrace. To transformation, Michael proposed as if raising an imaginary toast. To family, Lauren added. To the future, Amanda concluded. To all new beginnings, Beatrice smiled. Richard looked at his family, both biological and chosen, and felt a peace that no business success had ever brought him. To all the stories, he said, that are yet to come. The flash went off, capturing not just a group of people, but a moment of profound understanding. That true wealth lies not in what we possess, but in the lives we touch, the stories we transform, and the courage to let light shine through the cracks that life creates in our perfectly constructed plans. On the horizon, New York continued its perpetual motion. But now, through the transformed lens of this family, every building, every street, every person carried a story of potential and possibility. And at the top of the kaleidoscope, where once there had been only an empire of glass and steel, something far more valuable was blossoming. A legacy of transformation, built not with power and control, but with compassion, courage, and the willingness to see beauty in the most unexpected places.